Woman alone, lost in a maze of red cliffs, her strength failing, her water gone. She cries out to the heavens, believing no one will hear her. But someone does. A figure appears from the canyon's shadows, silent, powerful, and watching. Who is he? And why did he come when no one else did? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the red sandstone cliffs, turning the landscape into a shimmering canvas of crimson and gold. It was late August of 1873, and the heat seemed to rise from the earth itself, distorting the air above the ancient rock formations that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her brow with a trembling hand, her green eyes scanning the vast emptiness that surrounded her. She had been walking for hours, maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning in this labyrinth of stone and sand. Her wagon had broken an axle 2 days prior, miles back along what she thought was the trail to Fort Defiance. The merchant she had been traveling with, a gruff man named Silas Thornton, had promised to return with help, but that was yesterday morning. Sarah had waited as long as she could, rationing the little water they had left, but fear had finally driven her to move. She couldn't just sit there and wait to die. Her canvas dress, once a modest cream color, was now stained with red dust and dark patches of perspiration. The bonnet that had protected her fair skin hung limply around her neck, its strings cutting into her throat. Sarah was 24 years old, with long auburn hair that she had pinned up that morning, but now fell in disheveled waves around her shoulders. She had left Boston 3 months ago, following the promise of a teaching position in a small settlement near the New Mexico territory. Her father had been against it, but Sarah had always been headstrong, determined to make her own way in the world. Now, lost in this unforgiving wilderness, she wondered if her stubbornness would be her downfall. Her throat burned with thirst. The canteen at her hip had been empty since noon, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the western cliffs, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Beautiful, she thought bitterly, that something so deadly could be so breathtaking. Her legs ached, and blisters had formed on her feet inside her worn leather boots. Each step sent sharp pains shooting up her calves, but she forced herself to continue. Stopping meant giving up, and Sarah Mitchell had never been a quitter. As she rounded another massive outcropping of rock, the landscape before her seemed to shift and change, creating shadows that played tricks on her exhausted mind. Was that a path ahead, or just another dead end? She had tried to follow the sun, keeping it to her right to head north, but the maze of canyons and cliffs made straight travel impossible. She found herself doubling back, climbing over fallen rocks, sliding down sandy slopes that gave way beneath her feet. The fear that had been a constant companion since she found herself alone now threatened to overwhelm her completely. Sarah stopped, leaning against a sun-warmed boulder, and felt tears sting her eyes. She wouldn't cry. Crying was a waste of precious water her body couldn't afford to lose. But the desperation clawed at her chest, making it hard to breathe. What if no one ever found her? What if Silas had simply abandoned her, taken what little money she had hidden in the wagon, and left her to die? The thought made her anger flare, and she pushed away from the rock. Anger was better than fear. Anger kept you moving. She climbed over a ridge of loose stones, her hands scraping against the rough surface, and stood at the top, surveying the landscape once more. Nothing but red rock and blue sky. No signs of civilization, no smoke from campfires, no dust from horses or wagons. Just endless empty beauty that mocked her predicament. Sarah's lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue thick in her mouth. She knew the signs of severe dehydration. Her late mother had been a nurse, and Sarah had learned much from watching her tend to patients in their Boston home. The headache that pounded behind her eyes, the dizziness when she moved too quickly, the way her heart seemed to race even when she stood still, all of it pointed to her body shutting down. She needed water, and she needed it soon. As the sun continued its descent, Sarah forced herself down into another canyon, hoping against hope that she might find a spring or a pool of water collected in the rocks. The Navajo people lived in this region. She had heard stories about them during her journey west. They knew how to survive in this harsh land, how to find water where others saw only stone. If only she could find one of their camps, One of their people. Surely they would help her. The canyon floor was cooler, shaded by the high walls on either side. Sarah stumbled forward, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and harsh, echoing off the stone walls. Her foot caught on something, and she fell hard, her hands scraping against the sandy ground. Pain shot through her palms, and when she looked down, she saw blood mixing with the red dirt. For a moment, she simply lay there, wondering if this was it, if this was where her journey would end. But something in her refused to surrender. With great effort, Sarah pushed herself to her knees, then to her feet. She swayed, reaching out to steady herself against the canyon wall. The rock felt solid, eternal, and she drew strength from it. If these cliffs could stand for thousands of years against wind and rain and time itself, surely she could manage a few more steps. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature began to drop. Soon it would be night, and the desert cold would be as dangerous as the daytime heat. Sarah knew she needed to find shelter, but her body was failing her. Each breath came harder than the last, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She rounded another bend in the canyon, and suddenly her knees buckled. She fell forward, catching herself with her hands, but she couldn't find the strength to rise again. Kneeling there in the red sand, Sarah felt the last of her hope begin to slip away. She had tried so hard, fought so desperately, but the desert was simply too vast, too unforgiving. A sob escaped her lips, then another, and soon she was crying in earnest, her tears falling onto the thirsty earth below. In that moment of utter despair, Sarah did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She prayed. Not the formal prayers of Sunday service, but a desperate, heartfelt plea from the depths of her soul. She lifted her face to the darkening sky and called out, her voice hoarse and broken. The words were barely coherent, a mixture of prayer and plea, asking for salvation, for mercy, for someone, anyone, to help her. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and faded into silence. Sarah closed her eyes, waiting for nothing, expecting nothing, her body trembling with exhaustion and dehydration. Then she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on sand. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, creating phantom sounds to comfort her in her final moments. But the footsteps grew closer, more distinct, and Sarah forced her eyes open. Through her blurred vision, she saw a figure approaching, silhouetted against the canyon wall. Tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a confidence and grace that seemed almost otherworldly in her confused state. As the figure drew nearer, Sarah could make out more details. A man, unmistakably Navajo, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore traditional clothing, a dark blue shirt and deerskin leggings, with a red sash tied around his waist. His face was strong and angular, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to assess her situation in an instant. He carried a bow across his back and a leather water pouch at his side. Sarah tried to speak, to thank him, to beg for help, but no words would come. Her throat was too dry, her strength too depleted. She simply stared up at him, this warrior who had appeared before her, like an answer to her desperate prayer. He knelt beside her without hesitation, his movements quick but gentle. He removed the water pouch from his side and carefully lifted it to her lips. The water was warm, but to Sarah, it tasted like heaven itself. He let her drink slowly, just a little at first, his hand steady as he supported the pouch. When she had taken a few sips, he pulled it away, speaking to her in a language she didn't understand, but in a tone that was unmistakably reassuring. His voice was deep and calm, with an authority that made her feel, for the first time in days, that she might actually survive this ordeal. Sarah's vision began to clear slightly as the water worked its way through her system. She could see him more clearly now. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with weathered brown skin and eyes that held both strength and surprising gentleness. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, and his hands, though calloused and strong, handled the water pouch with careful precision. He spoke again, and this time Sarah caught a few words that sounded like questions. She shook her head, frustrated by the language barrier, and tried to gesture to explain her situation. The warrior seemed to understand. He looked around the canyon, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, then back at her. He said something else, his tone more urgent now, and gently helped her to her feet. Sarah's legs nearly gave out again, but he caught her, his arms solid and strong around her waist. The warrior supported Sarah's weight effortlessly as he guided her deeper into the canyon, following a path that seemed invisible to her untrained eyes, but was clearly familiar to him. The evening air grew cooler with each passing moment, and Sarah found herself grateful for the warmth radiating from his body as he half carried her along. She tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but her body felt disconnected, as though she were floating somewhere above herself, watching this scene unfold from a distance. After what felt like both an eternity and mere moments, they arrived at a small alcove carved into the canyon wall by centuries of wind and water. A modest camp was set up there, a bedroll, a small fire pit with stones arranged in a circle, and several leather pouches hanging from wooden stakes driven into cracks in the rock. The warrior eased Sarah down onto the bedroll with surprising gentleness, then immediately set about building a fire as darkness descended fully upon the canyon. Sarah watched him work, mesmerized by the efficiency of his movements. He gathered kindling from a pile of dried brush, struck flint against steel, and within minutes had coaxed flames to life. The warm glow pushed back the darkness and brought comfort to the cold night air. He retrieved a small pot from among his supplies, filled it with water from a larger container stored in the shade of the rocks, and set it over the fire to heat. As the water warmed, he turned his attention back to Sarah. He studied her carefully, his dark eyes moving over her sunburned face, her cracked lips, her trembling hands. Then he spoke, slowly and clearly, pointing to himself. "Ashki," he said, then repeated it, touching his chest. "Ashki." Sarah understood. It was his name. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat painfully and tried again. "Sarah," she managed, pointing to herself. "Sarah Mitchell." Ashki nodded, a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. He repeated her name, his pronunciation careful, making it sound both familiar and somehow new. "Sarah." Then he turned back to the fire, checking the water, and pulled out what looked like dried meat and some kind of flatbread from one of his pouches. He offered them to her, making eating motions, his expression encouraging. Sarah took the food gratefully, though her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it. Ashki steadied her hands with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. She managed to take a small bite of the bread, and though it was plain and unsalted, it tasted wonderful to her starving body. She chewed slowly, remembering her mother's warnings about eating too quickly after prolonged hunger. Ashki seemed to approve of her caution, nodding as he watched her eat. When the water was warm, he poured some into a wooden cup and handed it to her. Sarah drank it slowly, savoring each sip, feeling strength gradually returning to her limbs. As she drank, Ashki prepared his own simple meal, settling across the fire from her. The flames danced between them, casting flickering shadows on the canyon walls, and Sarah found herself studying this man who had saved her life. He was undeniably handsome, with strong, noble features that spoke of generations of people who had learned to thrive in this harsh landscape. His movements were precise and purposeful, never wasted, each action flowing naturally into the next. There was a quiet confidence about him, a self-assurance that came not from arrogance, but from deep knowledge and capability. Sarah had never met anyone quite like him. As they ate in companionable silence, Sarah's mind began to work through her situation more clearly now that she wasn't on the verge of death. She was lost, alone except for this stranger who didn't speak her language, with no way to reach Fort Defiance or find the settlement where she was supposed to teach. Her wagon was miles away, probably stripped bare by now if anyone had found it. All her possessions, her clothes, her books, her teaching materials, everything was gone. The weight of her predicament settled over her like a heavy blanket, and despite her best efforts, tears began to slip down her cheeks. She turned her face away, embarrassed to cry in front of this warrior who had shown her nothing but kindness. But Ashki noticed immediately. He set down his food and moved around the fire to sit beside her. He didn't touch her, respecting her space, but his presence was comforting. He spoke softly in his own language, and though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the tone was clear. Reassurance, comfort, a promise that she wasn't alone. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand and tried to smile at him, wanting him to know she appreciated everything he had done. Ashki returned the smile, and in that moment, something passed between them, a connection that transcended language, a recognition of shared humanity in the face of the desert's indifference. As the night deepened and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion above them, Ashki began to speak again, this time with gestures and simple words, trying to communicate with her. He pointed to himself, then made walking motions with his fingers, then pointed in what Sarah assumed was the direction of his home. He held up fingers. 3 days, she thought he was saying. Then he pointed to her and made the same walking gesture, followed by pointing in another direction and holding up more fingers. Sarah tried to understand. Was he saying his home was 3 days away, and that he could take her somewhere in several more days? She nodded, hoping she was interpreting correctly, and pointed to herself, then in the direction she thought Fort Defiance might be, her expression questioning. Ashki seemed to understand. He nodded, then held up fingers again. 5, maybe 6 days of travel. He made gestures indicating rest, water, safety, trying to convey that he would help her reach her destination. Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. He wasn't going to abandon her. He was going to help her reach civilization, even though it would take him far out of his way. She reached out impulsively and took his hand, squeezing it gratefully. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Ashki looked down at their joined hands, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper that she couldn't quite identify. His hand was warm and strong around hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then he squeezed her hand gently in return before releasing it and standing. He retrieved a blanket from his supplies and draped it carefully over her shoulders, tucking it around her with almost tender care. He gestured that she should sleep, pointing to the bedroll, then to himself and the ground nearby where he would keep watch. Sarah wanted to protest, to insist that he take the bedroll, but exhaustion was already pulling at her, and she knew she needed to rest if she was going to survive the journey ahead. She lay down, pulling the blanket close, and watched as Ashki added more wood to the fire and settled himself against the canyon wall, his bow within easy reach. As Sarah's eyes grew heavy, she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. Just days ago, she had been so certain of her path, so confident in her plans. Now everything had changed. She was completely dependent on this Navajo warrior, this stranger whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she didn't understand. Yet somehow, lying here under the stars with the fire crackling softly and Ashki keeping watch, she felt safer than she had in months. Sleep claimed her quickly, deep and dreamless, her body finally able to rest knowing that someone was protecting her. Throughout the night, whenever she stirred, she could sense Ashki's presence, solid and reassuring. Once she woke to find him adding wood to the fire, and their eyes met across the flames. He nodded to her, a silent assurance that all was well, and she drifted back to sleep with a sense of peace she hadn't expected to feel. Morning came with the gradual brightening of the sky above the canyon walls. Sarah woke to the smell of something cooking over the fire. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore but feeling considerably better than the previous night. Ashki was preparing a simple breakfast, more of the flatbread, and what looked like a porridge made from ground corn. He smiled when he saw her awake and offered her a cup of the warm mixture. As they ate, Ashki began to teach her words in his language. He pointed to the fire and said "ko," then had her repeat it. She stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, but he was patient, correcting her gently until she got it right. Then he pointed to the water, the bread, the sky, teaching her the Navajo words for each. Sarah found herself smiling despite everything, charmed by his teaching method, and determined to learn as much as she could. After breakfast, Ashki packed his camp with practiced efficiency, showing Sarah how to roll the bedroll properly and secure the supplies. He filled his water pouches from the larger container, then carefully concealed the remainder in the shade of the rocks, a cache he could return to later, she realized. Throughout these preparations, he continued teaching her words, and she began teaching him English in return. When everything was ready, they set out, Ashki leading the way through the maze of canyons with absolute confidence. He adjusted his pace to match Sarah's limited stamina, stopping frequently to let her rest and drink water. As they walked, he would point out things in the landscape, animal tracks in the sand, plants that held water, signs that indicated they were on the right path. Sarah watched and learned, amazed by how much information he could read in what looked to her like empty wilderness. By midday, they reached a small spring hidden among the rocks, where clear water bubbled up from deep underground and collected in a natural basin. Ashki let Sarah drink her fill, then refilled all their water pouches. As they rested in the shade of an overhanging cliff, Sarah found herself studying Ashki more openly. She had never been this close to a Navajo man before, had never really known anything about their people beyond the vague stories and often prejudiced opinions she had heard from other settlers. But Ashki was nothing like those stories had suggested. He was intelligent, resourceful, kind, and patient. The way he moved through this landscape showed a deep understanding and respect for the land that Sarah found herself admiring. He didn't conquer the desert. He lived in harmony with it, reading its signs, following its rhythms. There was a wisdom in that, she thought, that her own people could learn from. As if sensing her thoughts, Ashki turned and found her watching him. Their eyes met and held, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush with color that had nothing to do with the sun. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart beat faster, a question in his dark eyes that she couldn't quite interpret. She looked away first, flustered by feelings she didn't fully understand, and wasn't sure she should be having about this man who was so different from anyone she had ever known. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they left the deep canyons behind and entered more open terrain, dotted with juniper trees and sagebrush. Sarah's strength was returning with each passing hour, though she still relied heavily on Ashki's guidance and support. He remained patient and attentive, always aware of her limitations, never pushing her beyond what she could handle. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Ashki led them to another sheltered spot, this time beneath a massive boulder that created a natural overhang. He set about making camp with the same efficient grace Sarah had observed the night before, and she found herself helping without being asked, anticipating what needed to be done. That evening, as they sat by the fire eating their simple meal, Sarah realized how much had changed in just 2 days. The terror and desperation she had felt when lost in the canyons seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by something she hadn't expected. A growing sense of connection to this quiet warrior who had saved her life. She caught herself watching the way firelight played across his strong features, the way his hands moved as he worked, the rare but genuine smiles he gave her when she successfully repeated a Navajo phrase. Ashki seemed to sense the shift in her attention. He looked up from the fire and their eyes met again, but this time Sarah didn't look away. For a long moment they simply gazed at each other across the flames, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something in his expression, warmth, interest, perhaps even affection, that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion. He spoke then, his voice soft and thoughtful, a string of Navajo words she couldn't understand but that sounded almost like poetry. Then he switched to the broken English he had been learning from her, searching for the right words. "You, strong," he said, pointing to his heart and then to hers. "Strong. Here." He tapped his chest again, trying to convey something deeper than physical strength. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "You saved my life, Ashki. I don't know how to repay such a gift." Ashki shook his head, clearly understanding enough to disagree with the need for repayment. He pointed to the sky, made a gesture that seemed to encompass everything around them, then placed his hand over his heart. Sarah thought she understood. He was saying that helping her was simply the right thing to do, part of his way of living in balance with the world. It was a philosophy so different from the transactional relationships she had known in Boston, where everything had a price and nothing came without strings attached. On the third morning of their journey together, Sarah woke to find Ashki already up, standing at the edge of their camp and looking out across the landscape with an expression of concern. She rose and joined him, following his gaze. In the distance she could see smoke rising, not the thin, controlled smoke of a campfire, but thick black columns that spoke of something burning, Something wrong. Ashki turned to her, his face grave, and pointed to the smoke. He spoke rapidly in Navajo, then switched to English, his words urgent. Bad, soldiers maybe, my people. He struggled to find the words, frustration evident in his expression. He pointed to himself, then to the smoke, then made a gesture of going, leaving. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She understood. His people might be in danger and he needed to go to them. But what would happen to her? She was still at least 3 or 4 days from Fort Defiance, and she couldn't make it alone. The panic must have shown on her face because Ashki immediately reached out and took her hands in his, squeezing them reassuringly. He pointed to her, then to himself, then in the direction of the smoke, making walking motions. He was asking if she would come with him, Sarah realized. It would take them away from Fort Defiance, away from her original destination, but he wasn't going to abandon her. He was offering to take her with him, even though it might put her in danger, even though his own people might not welcome a white woman in their midst. Sarah looked into his eyes, those dark, honest eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness, and made her decision. She squeezed his hands in return and nodded firmly. "I'll go with you," she said clearly. "Wherever you need to go, I'll follow." Something shifted in Ashki's expression, relief, gratitude, and something deeper that made Sarah's pulse quicken. He raised one of her hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and unexpected that Sarah felt her cheeks flame with color. Then he released her and quickly began breaking camp, his movements urgent now. They traveled faster than before, Ashki setting a pace that pushed Sarah's endurance but that she was determined to match. She could feel his worry radiating from him, could see the tension in his shoulders as they moved toward the smoke. After several hours of hard travel, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley where a small encampment of traditional Navajo hogans sat nestled against a cliff face. Relief flooded Ashki's features. The structures were intact, not burning. The smoke they had seen was coming from further north, from a different location. But as they descended into the valley, Sarah could see people moving about with obvious agitation. Women were gathering children, men were collecting weapons, and an atmosphere of tension hung over the entire camp. As they entered the encampment, people stopped and stared at Sarah with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and a face lined with years of wisdom approached them, speaking rapidly to Ashki in Navajo. Her eyes kept darting to Sarah, clearly questioning why he had brought a white woman to their camp. Ashki responded calmly but firmly, gesturing to Sarah and speaking at length. Sarah caught her own name and thought she heard him use some of the words he had taught her. Words about help, about water, about being lost. The older woman listened, her expression softening slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. She finally nodded and said something that made Ashki relax visibly. He turned to Sarah and took her hand, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the watching tribe members. "My mother," he said, pointing to the older woman. "She says, you stay. Safe." His English was improving rapidly, Sarah noticed, necessity driving him to learn faster. Sarah smiled at his mother and tried one of the Navajo phrases Ashki had taught her, a greeting and an expression of gratitude. The older woman's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then a small smile touched her lips. She responded in Navajo, her tone considerably warmer, and reached out to touch Sarah's cheek gently, before turning and speaking to the other women nearby. Over the next few hours, as the tribe dealt with the crisis that had caused the smoke, a brush fire started by lightning that had threatened a neighboring camp but was now under control, Sarah found herself being cautiously accepted into the community. The women showed her where she could wash, gave her clean clothes to replace her ruined dress, and even shared food with her. Ashki's mother, whose name Sarah learned was Desba, seemed particularly interested in her, asking questions through Ashki's translation and studying Sarah with keen, intelligent eyes. As evening fell and the crisis passed, Ashki found Sarah sitting near the fire with several of the tribe's women, attempting to help them prepare the evening meal despite the language barrier. He watched her for a moment, a smile playing at his lips, before approaching. He spoke to the women, who giggled and whispered among themselves before nodding and shooing him away with playful gestures. Ashki offered Sarah his hand and pulled her to her feet. Come, he said simply, and led her away from the busy center of camp to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, turning the landscape into a masterpiece of reds and golds, and Sarah caught her breath at the beauty of it. They stood side by side in silence for several minutes, and Sarah found herself acutely aware of how close Ashki was standing, how she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, how her hand still tingled from where he had held it earlier. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression serious but tender. "You stay here?" he asked in English, the question clearly difficult for him to articulate. With my people? Or I take you, Fort Defiance?" He gestured in the direction of the fort, then back to the camp, his eyes searching her face. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she realized what he was really asking. He was giving her a choice. He would honor his commitment to take her to the fort if that was what she wanted. But he was also offering her an alternative, a chance to stay here, with him, with his people. It was a question that went far beyond simple logistics, and they both knew it. She thought about Boston, about her father's house with its formal parlors and rigid social expectations. She thought about the teaching position she had been traveling to, a life that would have been respectable but lonely, bound by conventions and propriety. Then she thought about the past 3 days, the terror and the salvation, the quiet companionship around evening fires, the way Ashki had looked at her with respect and growing affection, never once treating her as weak or lesser despite saving her life. Sarah reached out and took Ashki's hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I want to stay," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the enormousness of what she was saying. "Here, with you, if you want me to stay." Ashki's face transformed with a smile so brilliant it took Sarah's breath away. He raised their joined hands and pressed them against his heart, then spoke in Navajo, words that sounded like a promise or perhaps a vow. Then in English he said, I want very much." He struggled for more words, finally settling on simply pulling her closer until they stood with barely any space between them. Sarah looked up into his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. Wonder, joy, the beginning of something deep and true. When he lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, she instead rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise, a joining that felt both thrilling and somehow inevitable, as if they had been moving toward this moment since he had first appeared in that canyon like an answer to her prayer. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing slightly harder, Ashki rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered again, and Sarah nodded against him. "I'll stay," she promised, "for as long as you'll have me." The path ahead wouldn't be easy, Sarah knew. There would be challenges, cultural differences to navigate, prejudices to face from both whites and Navajo who might not approve of their union, a whole new way of life to learn. But as Ashki took her hand and led her back toward the camp, toward his mother and his people who were already beginning to accept her, Sarah felt more certain of her choice than she had been about anything in her entire life. She had come west looking for a teaching position, for independence, for a new life. Instead, she had found something far more precious, a man who saw her for who she truly was, a community that valued different strengths than the one she had left behind, and a love that transcended the boundaries of language and culture. She had been lost in the Red Cliffs without direction, had called out for salvation, and a Navajo warrior had appeared before her. But he had given her so much more than rescue. He had given her a home, a purpose, and a future filled with possibility. As they rejoined the others around the evening fires, Desba caught Sarah's eye and smiled knowingly, gesturing for her to sit beside her. Ashki settled on Sarah's other side, his hand finding hers beneath the folds of her borrowed clothing, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. The tribe's elder began to speak, telling stories in Navajo that Ashki translated in whispered phrases, and Sarah listened with rapt attention, eager to learn everything about this new world she had chosen. The stars emerged one by one above them, the same stars that shone over Boston and Fort Defiance and every other place Sarah had ever been, but they looked different here, brighter somehow, more alive. She leaned slightly against Ashki's shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah learned the ways of Ashki's people. She learned to weave and to prepare traditional foods, to speak Navajo with increasing fluency, to read the signs of the land as Ashki did. And Ashki, in turn, learned from her English words and phrases, stories of the wider world beyond their valley, different ways of seeing and understanding. They taught each other, challenged each other, grew together. When autumn came and the tribe prepared for the winter months ahead, Ashki and Sarah stood before Desba and the tribal elders and pledged themselves to each other in a ceremony that blended both Navajo traditions and the Christian vows Sarah had grown up with. It was unconventional, perhaps even scandalous by the standards of both their peoples, but it was real and true and built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine affection, and a love that had been forged in the crucible of the desert. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Sarah would tell them the story of being lost in the Red Cliffs, of crying out for help, and of the warrior who had appeared before her like a miracle. And Ashki would add that he had been hunting that day, far from his usual territory, drawn by something he couldn't explain to that particular canyon at that particular time. They would tell their children that sometimes the most important moments in life come from the most desperate circumstances, and that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely people. But that evening, as they sat together under the stars with their tribe around them, and their future stretching out before them full of promise and possibility, Sarah and Ashki needed no words at all. They simply held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together, and looked forward to building a life that honored both their worlds while creating something entirely new and uniquely theirs.